Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we hear from renowned CNN journalist and political analyst Fareed Zakaria as we discuss the escalating conflict in Gaza and the growing tensions in Lebanon. Can the situation spiral further into chaos, or is there hope for resolution? What insights did Iran's new president share with him in a revealing interview this week? And with US elections just 1 month away, can Kamala Harris or Donald Trump offer any real solutions to the crises gripping the Middle East? Mr. Zakaria, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Now, I'd like to start with your analysis on the situation in Gaza. It's now been 1 year since the events of October the 7th, and it has been a year that has seen unimaginable violence in the region. Now, with the hostages still under Hamas custody, a horrific death toll in Gaza that is growing, as well as the recent escalation in Lebanon, which could see the conflict expanding even further. Frankly speaking, can the situation get any worse? And do you see it getting any better anytime soon?
That's a very difficult question because you've piled in a lot of things, but you're right too, because a lot of things are happening. I think it can get worse. It can escalate, and I think that we're at a fairly dangerous precipice now, because basically what we have so far been dealing with is, in a sense, a kind of asymmetrical strategy that Iran has put in place for a while now, even before October 7th, before the Gaza attack, which is that Iran, operating through its proxies, many of which are quite independent, as Hamas is, as Hezbollah, but there is a kind of coordinated strategy, have been trying to press Israel in various ways that are relatively low grade. So the Houthis firing missiles, diverting ships from the Persian Gulf, Hezbollah firing rockets into northern Israel, forcing people to move out. So occasionally Shia militias in Iraq have participated. And of course, then came the Gaza attack, which broke that pattern and did something much more dramatic. Now, the question is Israel seems to have decided to take this opportunity and try to do something much more dramatic to turn the tables on this axis of resistance. And it's been pushing very hard in Gaza, brutally so, with an incredible and tragic loss of civilian life. It has now started pushing very hard in Lebanon. And what it is finding, most interestingly, is that in Lebanon, Hezbollah is too battered to be able to really push back in a powerful way. And Iran is too cautious so far to push back in a dramatic way. What Iran did in its missile strikes was significant, but choreographed enough that, it basically killed no one. But Israel has said it now wishes to escalate. So Israel seems like it wants to really take this opportunity to do something dramatic. That's where we stand now. And if Bibi Netanyahu decides he's going to go and strike Iranian nuclear facilities, that will be a major escalation that Iran cannot ignore.
And of course, I think that is the main question of the hour. But a few months ago, you said that it was time to ask Israel some tough questions. Now, most notably, did it, as a democratic and open country, react appropriately to what occurred in October? And that these questions are important so that it doesn't look back at this period with shame and regret. But would you say now that this shame and regret is inevitable?
I think what it has done in Gaza, in my view, has been to pursue an approach that, while it has some rationale, is the wrong approach. When I say it has some rationale, what I mean is Israel did suffer a very brutal terrorist attack from Hamas on October 7th. Men, women, and children raped, murdered, abducted. uh, hundreds held hostage. So you can understand the Israeli government saying we have to do something and we have to strike hard. The question I asked in that piece, and I still believe is valid, is has Israel approached this in a way that really separates the terrorists from the civilian population in Gaza? Or has it approached it in a way that is largely lumped the two together? That is to say, yes, it's going after Hamas, but if civilians come in the way, if hospitals come in the way, if schools come in the way, Israel is not as concerned as I think it should be. Not only is that morally a problem, it's also politically a problem. General Petraeus, who led the American forces in the surge in Iraq, points out that Israel has to keep going back into areas that it thought it had cleared because it has so alienated the civilian population. It's created new radicals. Hamas simply has to wait until it leaves and then pops back up again. That it hasn't really been a particularly effective strategy. Meanwhile, it's destroyed 70% of the buildings in Gaza, all the schools, all the hospitals. That surely can't be the right strategy. So I think when you look at Gaza, I think Israel faces some very tough questions about how it has pursued this. Lebanon, I think it's a different issue. They have faced ongoing rocket fire from Hezbollah for years now. And I think that they've turned the tables on Hezbollah in a very dramatic way that might actually degrade Hezbollah in a way that is powerful and enduring.
And I think one of the big issues is whether this response has even been proportionate. Now, Israel has killed more than 41,500 people in Gaza in retaliation for Hamas killing around 1,200 people and taking around 250 people hostage. But let's talk a little bit about the Palestinian people themselves. I want to pick up on what you were saying about the civilians, because you said at one point you had sympathy for the Palestinian people, but not for the leadership. Now, you have criticised them for missing too many opportunities. We've now seen a big movement in the international community to recognise a Palestinian state. Assuming that this does happen, what support would such a state need so that it can prosper and live in peace?
So you're right. I've said that I have great sympathy for the Palestinian people and their plight and their legitimate demands, but I think they have been badly led. I think they've been led by a series of leaders who, in the case of Hamas, really have adopted a kind of terrorist mentality where it's okay to kill women, children, civilians. These are things, by the way, that were not adopted. These strategies were not adopted by African liberation movements like Nelson Mandela's. Certainly were not adopted by the Indian nationalist movement under Gandhi and Nehru. So it's a much more brutal form of violence that Hamas has adopted. On the other side, you have the Palestinian Authority that is so corrupt and ineffective that Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, cannot hold elections for fear of the fact that, of course, he will be voted out of office by an enraged Palestinian population. In addition to that, they've missed many negotiating opportunities along the way. So I do think they've been badly served. What can the Arabs do? Look, the Arabs have voiced a lot of rhetorical support over the years for the Palestinian people, but they haven't really done that much. I would argue that Saudi Arabia has been different in that regard. It had offered the Arab peace plan in, I think it was 2003, 2004. And now it is really only Saudi Arabia that has any leverage because it has the one thing Israel wants. Israel wants a normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia. If you look around the Arab world, even if you look at the United States, the person with the most leverage in that sense is Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. In return for normalization, he has the opportunity to ask for something, but it has to be something that's within the realm of practical, that is something you could imagine an Israeli government accepting. So that's going to be the very complicated dance. Right now, my sense is Bibi Netanyahu is less concerned about the Arab normalization, the Saudi normalization, because he realizes that anything he says that puts him on the path toward granting the Palestinians political rights, statehood, whatever, will be too much for his coalition partners that include, a few very, very extreme Israeli nationalists who believe in essentially no Palestinian state ever. So he knows that if he goes even half a step towards that, he loses his government. So maybe that's why he's decided, I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to go forward and deal with Hezbollah in a much more aggressive way than I'm going to, because I can't do the Saudi normalization deal anyway. So that's where we are. But I think still, at some point, the only leverage anyone holds remains the Saudi government, and it'll be interesting to see how they exercise it.
And it very much feels like Mr. Netanyahu doesn't want peace. I think he desperately wants to remain in office. If he loses his post as Prime Minister, we could see the corruption charges against him continue in full force. And even back in 2021, you remarked that Netanyahu had effectively killed the two-state solution. And I agree, particularly considering the stance of his current ultra-right-wing government, which seem firmly opposed to it. But looking at the broader population since October the 7th, there's been numerous opinion polls that are indicating even the Israeli public itself appears to have little appetite for such a solution. Wouldn't you agree?
So, Katie, you're right. Bibi Netanyahu has always played games with the two-state solution. In the past, he would pretend that he was in favor of it, or say things like, I'm in favor only if it's a disarmed Palestinian state and we, Israel, control the airspace and the borders and foreign policy and things like that. Now he has moved to a much more openly rejectionist position, partly because his coalition is that way. But let's be honest, Israel has changed. It is much more right-wing now. The Knesset had a vote on the two-state solution. I think only 8 members of Israel's parliament voted in favor of a two-state solution. I think it was 68 who voted against. So you're in a very difficult place in Israel if you want a two-state solution. But what I come back to is what is the solution that people in Israel have for the problem of the Palestinian people? Ehud Omer, former Likud prime minister, right-wing prime minister, said very eloquently on my television program, look, there's 6 million Palestinians in Israel who don't have any political rights. How can Israel as a democracy continue like that? At some point, there has to be some resolution to that. And the only resolution he was arguing that makes any sense, that is compatible with the idea of Israel as a democracy, would be to give the Palestinians a state. And, when you talk to people who are opponents of the two-state solution, they fudge and obfuscate and meander. They don't actually ever answer that question centrally, because what they are accepting is a completely intolerable situation, which is two classes of citizens. The Palestinians not even really being citizens. They are citizens of nowhere. They don't have political rights. And that surely can't continue unendingly. But it is. We are in the 56th year of that circumstance, that occupation.
Absolutely, and we have seen it continue on for decades. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the US role in all of this too. You've previously said that the Biden administration's policy of closely hugging Israel by providing it with the support and the arms that it needs in the hope to influence the decision-making has ultimately failed. Now, obviously, we're now just weeks out from the US elections. They're just around the corner. Which of the two candidates would you say has a better chance, if at all, of resolving this conflict?
It's going to be very hard for either of them to do it, because Bibi Netanyahu knows one country almost as well as he knows Israel, and that is the United States. And he knows how to play the American political system to his advantage. So when he faces a Democrat who is trying to press him to be more conciliatory, to try to, for example, move down a path of a two-state solution, which he did with Barack Obama, he essentially goes around the president of the United States directly to the Republicans, makes deals with them, puts pressure on the Democratic president to go along in a way that's very clever and effective. When it's a Republican president, he has that support, but then he can bolster it because there are a lot of Democrats in the Senate who are also very supportive. The truth is the American political system is quite supportive of Israel, and it's not, as a lot of people in this region think, it's not all about the Jews. Yes, Jewish Americans are important and have political views as they should in a democracy, but it's also that there's a very broad support in America for Israel. There are people on the Christian right who do it for their own, kind of theological reasons, but there are a lot of people who do it because they regard Israel as a kind of embattled democracy that is finally giving a state to a stateless people who have been persecuted for 2,000 years. There's a lot of, that resonates with Americans. So I think it's a mistake to view it as something nefarious. There's broad support in America for Israel, and Bibi Netanyahu knows how to play with that. So I doubt you're going to see much reining in that the American president is able to do. There will be a bit on the margins. I suspect a Democratic administration would be able to restrain them a little more. But ironically, again, we come back to the one person who has leverage in all of this is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, because he has something Israel wants that otherwise they won't be given to them. The Americans, it's very hard, even if Congress can pass laws that would even Israel probably has a strong enough support that they could even override a presidential veto in some circumstances.
And I want to ask you about Saudi Arabia's role a little bit later. But of course, former President Donald Trump has been very vocal about the attacks this week. He says these kinds of attacks would never have happened under his leadership. Conversely, quite a different approach with Kamala Harris. In fact, there's reports that if Vice President Harris does become president, she's broadly expected to replace some of the main architects of the Biden administration's strategy in Gaza. But ultimately, time will tell whether we are actually able to see any progress. But let's talk about the growing escalation between Israel and Hezbollah with the recent assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and most of his deputies. What's your prediction on what happens next? Do you think we could see a new Israeli occupation of the south, a new civil war, or could Lebanon finally have an independent and strong government that will pull the nation out of misery?
It's really extraordinary, first, just to note how well Israeli intelligence was able to penetrate Hezbollah. The pagers, the locations of the weapons caches, and of course the locations of the leadership, including Nasrallah. And what that tells me is that Hezbollah, which was often viewed as this fearsome fighting force, had also become, fat, corrupt, an organization that lived off of all kinds of corruption and arms deals and patronage from Iran, and so was more easily penetrated than one might have imagined. Israel really has destroyed a very large part of it. But Hezbollah is not just a militant organization. It's also a social political organization in Lebanon. And that's why I wonder if you could just there are people who are saying Hezbollah will collapse, and as you said, maybe Lebanon, the Lebanese government will be able to assert itself. Well, as you well know, the problem with that is the Lebanese government is this strange concoction, this strange coalition, this embodied compromise between a shrinking Christian population, a Sunni population, and a majority Shia population. Now, Hezbollah does represent the interests of the majority Shia population. So far, I have not seen anything in Lebanon that suggests there is a Shia alternative to Hezbollah. To say that the Lebanese government or the problem there is those are all Sunnis and Christians. Who is going to represent the majority Shia population? Until you can find an alternative to Hezbollah, for them, they're going to have some role. So I don't think they disappear.
And I think that's the issue. Hezbollah is so firmly entrenched, not only in the government, but in every way of life in Lebanon. Now, I saw you'd recently interviewed the new Iranian president during the UN General Assembly. And what really fascinated me is that, surprisingly, he admitted that Hezbollah doesn't have the military might to respond to Israel. Now, this seems shocking on so many levels. Do you think that Iran has left Hezbollah out to dry as part of a deal? Or do you think that they were shocked with the infiltration and lack of resources that Hezbollah has?
I think you noted something, you picked up on something, Katie, that I was also very struck by. the Iranian president not only essentially said this was up to Hezbollah, and by the way, I don't see how Hezbollah could really mount a defense. Israel is so much more powerful. It has so much. Its weapons are so much more powerful, and it's supported by the United States. He also implied that Iran did not have the capacity. He said, he said essentially we should call a meeting of Islamic countries to condemn what Israel is doing. Now, that's not a particularly lethal response that you'd imagine, and very different from his predecessors. I had interviewed his predecessor, President Raisi, only a year ago, I think, and he had a very different, much more militant, much more hardline view, and would never have expressed openly that the idea that Hezbollah didn't actually have that lethal an arsenal. So there's some shift in Iran that's interesting. You never know how much power the president has, but I think that what we are seeing both with Hezbollah and with Iran is that perhaps we have painted them to be 10 feet tall when they were really, more like 5 feet tall. I think we do this a lot, and there's a kind of weird set of reasons why this tends to happen. For Israel, it allows them to be arguing that they need to permanently be on the offensive, taking very aggressive measures. For people in the United States, who are very hawkish, they want to maintain crippling sanctions on Iran. But the reality is, Iran is a country that's been under sanctions for almost 4 decades now. You can tell how it lacks modernization of basic equipment from the fact that just 6 months ago, its president and foreign minister were killed in a helicopter crash that took place, as far as we can tell, because they were in an American helicopter that they had bought, that was bought during the Shah of Iran's time and lacked maintenance and spare parts. A country like that is unlikely to have the most fearsome military in the Middle East, particularly compared with Israel and Saudi Arabia, which have very modern, very advanced weaponry and are very well maintained.
And I think you make an excellent point there as well. But let's turn our attention to the reason you're in Saudi Arabia at the moment, where you join us from this week. You've had an incredible talk at the Riyadh International Book Fair. Now, your most recent book is called The Age of Revolutions. And many analysts have pointed out that some of the reforms that have been taking place in the kingdom for quite some time, well, some were skeptical, some were optimistic. But what I think everyone seems to agree on is that it feels like a very historic period. Would you say that it is a revolution?
I think there's no question there is enormous change taking place in Saudi Arabia, and it takes place at so many levels. That the ones that I'm most struck by, of course, is the role of women, but I'm also struck by the role of Saudis. And this to me is a very interesting and somewhat unremarked upon change. When I'd come here before, 10 years ago or so, the person who would drive your car, who would check you in at your hotel, who would serve you your meal, was never Saudi. These were Pakistanis, these were Bangladeshis, these were Indians, sometimes Filipino. Now most of them are Saudi. And there is a kind of both that you see Saudis participating in the life of the economy more, you see them participating in the life of society more, and you see a certain pride that they have about all this. So to me, there's something very interesting. You can see all the physical changes, of course, and they're very dramatic, but there's a change in mentality that's very powerful as far as I can tell in terms of what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Now, and it follows very much along the themes of the book. Moving a society forward, but not moving it so fast to overwhelm the society with change. And that is clearly what Saudi Arabia is trying to experiment with here. There are areas where it's moving very fast. There are areas where it is still being somewhat restrained. And there are people who wish that it moved faster. And whether they've got the balance right, I don't know, but I am impressed that they are trying to strike a balance, that they are trying to push some things forward and modernize in some areas. For example, the role of women really has been transformed, but there are some areas, for example, where there's still the requirement and encouragement that Saudis dress in traditional clothes. There are still certain restrictions, for example, the restriction on alcohol. So they're trying to balance this in a way that doesn't become too revolutionary. But I think when you look at it in historical terms, clearly this will be seen as a revolution. But it's a revolution that I would say is being played out in an incremental way, in an organic way, so as not to overwhelm, so that the change isn't so overwhelming that you get what I describe in the book often happening, a backlash.
And I think it's quite interesting because at some point you were quite a skeptic of the Gulf in general. Now, today you join us from Riyadh. Do you think that the whole region is changing? Obviously, you've mentioned it's a different case when it comes to somewhere like Iran, but do you feel that when you visit places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi or Doha, do you feel that the whole region is changing and hopefully for the better?
Yeah, I was a skeptic for many years about the Gulf, only in the sense that I felt that they were very passive. They were not all they wanted to do was to get rich. They weren't trying to play a constructive role in stabilizing and integrating the region. And I think that has changed. And I think it's changed in part because of what's been happening in Saudi Arabia. The UAE, to be fair, may even have been one of the first to begin that process. But now that Saudi Arabia is on board, of course, it's much larger, much more powerful, and can have a much more positive influence. You see that with Qatar as well, where it is trying to play the role of an honest broker. So yeah, I think that the Gulf has been transformed. Look, I think one of the big shifts in the world that's taken place that I talk about is that the Arab world is now being defined and led by the Gulf, which is historically not been the case. I mean, if you look at the 50s, 60s, 70s, the Arab world was defined by its big, large states that were historically important: Egypt, Syria, Iraq. Today, and then in the 70s, you went through maybe a period of turmoil around Iran and the revolution, the Islamic Revolution. But today, what is clear is that these smaller but very rich and very powerful countries, starting with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain, are in the driver's seat, and they're trying to move the region towards stability, economic integration, greater interdependence, more ties with more countries, even and including Israel. That I think is the context in which you have to think about that normalize the Abraham Accords, which is the whole effort has been to reach out. It's, they're reaching out to India, they're reaching out to China. And this is, in my opinion, all for the good, because the more trade, commerce, interdependence, integration takes place, the more the average person in the Arab world is going to benefit, because his or her living standards will rise.
Oh, absolutely. And as someone who's been based in the region for 15 years, I can tell you personally, it has been fascinating to witness these changes firsthand. But we are almost out of time, but I can't let you go without asking you about the US election. And I know it's slightly off topic, but tell me, who does Fareed Zakaria want to win? And who does Fareed Zakaria think is going to win?
Look, it's anyone who tells you they know who's going to win is, I think, wildly exaggerating their powers of wisdom. It is essentially a statistical tie. If you look at it, Kamala Harris in the national polls is up about 2.5, 3 percentage points within the margin of error. That is, Hillary Clinton won the national vote by 3.5%, but still lost the Electoral College. In the Electoral College in every state, whoever's leading is leading by 2 or 3 points, and that's again within the margin of error. So it would be foolhardy for me to make a prediction about who's going to win. And rather than tell you, I try not to approach this with the idea that I have I'm rooting for a team, but I'll tell you my central concern as somebody who focuses on international affairs. The United States has, in my opinion, played an absolutely pivotal and indispensable role in the world by maintaining, alliances like NATO that have kept the peace in Europe for 75 years, by maintaining a balance of power in China, by maintaining a balance of power in Asia, which has been able to allow countries like Japan and South Korea and China and Australia to flourish, by being, in a sense, the kind of global, not policeman, but kind of, guarantor of last resort. if the United States pulls back from that role, and there are some people in the Republican Party, and there are some people around Trump, and occasionally Donald Trump, you never know with him because he changes his mind very often. But there has been a kind of isolationism in the Republican Party that would pull America out of all this. I think that's very worrying. And I think that should worry people in the Arab world because, it's easy to criticize America and it's easy to have to say it did all these things wrong. And I don't dispute it makes many mistakes and it's made many big mistakes. But a world without a power like that, a world where, say, Russia was the dominant power or China was the dominant power, more importantly, there were no dominant power. And you had just a kind of anarchy in every country asserting its rights. That would not be a good world, particularly for small countries, for medium-sized powers, because it would mean the strong would do what they can and the weak would suffer what they must, as a famous.
Okay, I take your point, but equally, is there any chance to get you to name a candidate?
I think I am better. I think it's better for me to play the role I do at CNN by trying to describe the issues and to describe the things I worry about if one of them were to win. Because I part of it is, honestly, Katie, I'm not that partisan. I mean, if Trump came in and did some good things, I'd cheer him on. When he did, I did cheer him on. I try to approach this from the perspective of somebody who is looking at the issues and not at the horse race and who I should bet on.
Well, the clock is ticking. We'll be finding out in just a matter of weeks. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it and enjoy your time in Riyadh. Thank you.
Katie, it was a pleasure for me to be on. Thank you.